The man worked the fence line under a sun that gave no quarter, a flat, white disk in a bleached blue sky that offered no promise of clouds, no hint of relief. His name was Silas, though the name was a convenience, a simple sound for a simple life, and he had not heard it spoken aloud in a very long time. His hands, gloved in worn leather, moved with a deliberation that wasted nothing. Not a twist of the wire, not a tap of the hammer against the staple. The rhythm was its own language, a conversation between muscle and wood and metal that had long ago replaced the need for other words. He would set the post, brace it with stones, and stretch the wire until it sang with a low, tense hum, a sound that meant security in a land that offered little of it. Heat shimmered up from the baked earth, distorting the horizon into a wavering line, and the silence was so complete it felt like a weight against his eardrums, broken only by the scrape of his boots on gravel and the dry buzz of insects hiding from the worst of the day. This was his world, a small patch of dirt and resilience carved out of an endless expanse of indifference, and he asked nothing more of it than to be left to the quiet labor of holding it together. He paused, leaning his weight against a newly set post, feeling the solidness of it, the satisfying resistance of a thing made right. He pulled a canteen from his belt, the water inside already warm, and drank sparingly, his eyes scanning the vastness, not out of fear, but out of a habit so deeply ingrained it was like breathing. And that is when he saw it. Far to the east, a smudge against the pale sky, thin and dark and unnatural. It was not a dust devil, which twisted and danced with a wild, brief life, nor was it the low haze of a distant storm that would never arrive. This was smoke. It rose in a steady, lazy column, a dark finger pointing accusingly at the heavens, speaking of something man-made and violent. He watched it for a long time, his face unreadable, the muscles in his jaw tight. The sun beat down, the wire hummed. The smoke continued to rise. He did not move. Afternoon. The smoke had thickened, then thinned, then vanished, leaving behind only a faint, acrid memory in the air and a dark stain on Silas's mind. He finished his work on the fence, his movements just as deliberate, just as measured, but the peace of the labor had been broken. The silence now felt different, heavier, charged with the question the smoke had asked. He packed his tools, coiling the leftover wire with neat, precise loops, and walked back toward the small, sturdy cabin that stood as a testament to his preference for solitude. It was a structure of economy and strength, built by his own hands from timber he had felled and shaped himself, and it had the same quiet, unassuming competence as the man who lived within it. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of dry wood and coffee. Everything had its place, a single tin plate and cup on a clean, scrubbed shelf, a rifle oiled and mounted above the stone fireplace, a small stack of worn books on a crate beside a simple cot. He moved through the space with an ingrained familiarity, stoking the embers in the wood stove to heat a pot of beans, the scrape of the spoon against the cast iron, the only sound. He ate standing by the open door, looking out at the landscape as the day began to fade, the brutal white light softening to gold, and then to a deep, bruised purple. The land was beautiful in its harshness, but he had learned long ago not to mistake its beauty for kindness. It was a place that stripped a man down to what he was, not who he wanted to be, and it had no patience for weakness or regret. He had come here to be forgotten, to let the man he used to be weather away like a rock in the wind, and for years it had worked. The quiet, the labor, the profound emptiness of the plains had been a balm, but the smoke was a reminder that the world of men, with its greed and its fire, was never as far away as one hoped. He would spend a long time afterward wondering why he did not simply ignore it, why he did not turn his back and let the silence reclaim him. Perhaps it was the memory of another fire, another life lost to ash and ambition, or perhaps it was simply that a thing set wrong in the world demanded to be set right, and he was, if nothing else, a man who understood the importance of a straight line and a solid foundation. He banked the fire and lay on his cot, but sleep did not come. He listened to the wind. Days later, she appeared. A figure shimmering in the heat haze at the edge of his property, so distant at first she could have been an animal or a ghost. She moved with a slow, exhausted shamble, a dark shape against the pale dirt, and as she drew closer, he saw she was a woman, leading a lame mule that carried a pathetic bundle of salvaged belongings. Her clothes were torn and stained with soot, her face a mask of grime and despair, but she walked with a grim determination that seemed to be the only thing holding her upright. She did not seem to see his cabin, her eyes fixed on some point in the infinite distance, and when she reached his newly mended fence line, she simply stopped, as if the wire were an impassable wall. Then her legs gave out, and she crumpled to the ground in a heap of exhaustion. He watched from his doorway for a full minute, his body utterly still. This was the answer to the smoke. He knew it with a certainty that settled like a stone in his gut. This was trouble, the kind he had spent a decade avoiding, walking toward him on broken feet. He could close the door. He could pretend he had seen nothing. The land was vast enough to swallow her whole, and no one would ever know. His old life had taught him the wisdom of walking away, of minding his own business, of letting the world burn as long as the flames did not touch him. He took a step back, his hand on the door frame, but then he saw her hand lying in the dust, fingers curled loosely around the mule's frayed rope lead. It was a small hand, blistered and raw, yet it held on. It was the hand of someone who had lost everything, but was not yet willing to let go of the last thing she had. He let out a slow breath, a sigh of resignation. He picked up his canteen and walked out into the unforgiving sun. He approached slowly, making enough noise with his boots that she would not be startled. Her eyes fluttered open as his shadow fell over her. They were wide with fear, the eyes of a cornered animal. He said nothing, simply uncorked the canteen and held it out. She stared at it, then at him, her gaze traveling over his weathered face, his plain work clothes, the stillness in his posture. She drank, gulping the warm water down with a desperation that was painful to watch. When she was done, she tried to push herself up, to regain some measure of dignity. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. He nodded, taking the canteen back. "They burned it," she said, not to him, but to the sky, to the dust, to the memory of the smoke. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, as plain and brutal as the landscape around them. "Who?" he asked, his own voice rough from disuse. "Sterling's men." The name meant nothing to him, but the action behind it was a story as old as the dirt they stood on. Greed with a face, greed with a torch. He looked at her, at the mule with its drooping head and injured leg, at the small, sad bundle of her life tied to its back. He looked toward the east, where the sky was once again clean and empty. He had a choice. He always had a choice. He could give her food and water and point her toward the nearest town, a 2-day walk she would likely not survive. Or he could do something else. He could invite the trouble in. "You can rest at the cabin," he said. It was not an offer of charity. It was a decision, and he felt the weight of it settle over him, as real and as heavy as a winter coat. Her name was Alara. She stayed in his cabin for 3 days, sleeping on a pallet he made for her by the hearth. And in that time, she spoke very little, but the story came out in broken pieces, like shards of a shattered pot. Her husband had died of a fever the previous winter, leaving her with a quarter section of land that was worthless to most, but for a single, stubborn creek that ran through it, making it the only watered parcel for miles. This man, Sterling, had been buying up all the dry claims, consolidating them into a massive cattle operation, and her land was the last piece he needed, the linchpin that held his empire together. He had made offers, first polite, then insulting, then threatening. She had refused. She had papers, a legal claim, filed by her husband, a testament to their dream of building something that would last. She believed in the law. She believed in what was right. Sterling's men had come at dusk, not with papers, but with torches. They had given her 5 minutes to gather what she could carry before setting the cabin, the barn, the winter hay, all of it ablaze. They had laughed while they did it. She had fled into the darkness with her mule, the glow of her burning life lighting the way. The town, she explained, was no help. The sheriff was on Sterling's payroll, and the townspeople were too afraid or too indebted to him to speak up. They watched her with pity, but no one offered a hand. She was alone. She told him all of this in a low, flat voice, her eyes staring into the fire as if reliving the memory. She never cried. Her grief was a thing too deep and too dry for tears. Silas listened, his face impassive. He cleaned and dressed the burn on her arm, stitched the torn fabric of her dress, and shared his meager meals without a word. He was a good listener, because he rarely spoke, and his silence created a space for her story to exist without judgment. On the 3rd day, she seemed to have regained some of her strength. She stood by the door, watching him split firewood, her posture straighter, a flicker of the woman she must have been returning to her eyes. "I suppose I should move on," she said, her voice still thin, but no longer broken. "There's nothing left for me here." He did not stop his work, the axe rising and falling in a steady, powerful rhythm. Thump, crack, thump, crack. He knew she was right. The logical thing, the safe thing, was for her to leave, to disappear into the vastness of the territory and try to start again somewhere else. He could go back to his quiet life. The fence was mended. The silence would return. But as he looked at her, standing there in her patched dress, a solitary figure of defiance against the endless horizon, he saw not a victim, but a survivor. He saw the same stubborn resilience that he had cultivated in himself, the same refusal to be broken by the world. To tell her to leave would be a betrayal of something he hadn't realized he still believed in. He finished splitting the last log, setting the axe carefully into the chopping block. He wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his glove. He looked from her to the empty wagon that sat near his barn, its wheels deep in the dust. The next morning, he was up before dawn. He loaded the wagon not with his rifle or his pistol belt, which lay in a locked chest under his cot, but with tools. He packed axes, a two-man saw, hammers, a box of nails, shovels, and all the rope he owned. He hitched his sturdy draft horse to the harness and filled 2 large water barrels. Alara watched him from the doorway, her face a mixture of confusion and dawning hope. He did not look at her until the wagon was fully loaded. He walked over to where she stood, the morning light still gray and soft. He stopped in front of her. "We're going back," he said. It was all he needed to say. She looked at him, and for the first time since she had arrived, a single tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She did not wipe it away. She simply nodded. The journey to her claim took the better part of the day, a slow, rattling trek across the sun-scorched plains. They rode in silence, the creak of the wagon wheels and the plodding hoof falls of the horse, the only sounds in the immense quiet. Silas drove, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, while Alara sat beside him, her gaze fixed forward, toward the place she had called home. When they arrived, the devastation was absolute. The cabin was a blackened skeleton of charred timbers, its stone chimney standing like a lonely tombstone against the sky. The barn had collapsed into a heap of smoldering ash and twisted metal. The air still hung heavy with the bitter smell of smoke and loss. Even the earth was scorched, a great black scar on the landscape. For a long moment, they both just sat on the wagon, taking in the totality of the destruction. It was a monument to casual cruelty, a testament to the kind of power that destroys simply because it can. Alara's face was pale, but her jaw was set. She slid down from the wagon seat before Silas could help her, her boots sinking into the ash. She walked slowly through the ruins, her hand trailing over a blackened post, her gaze sweeping over the wreckage of her life. Silas watched her, giving her the space she needed. He expected tears, or a scream of rage, or the final, shuddering collapse of her spirit. Instead, she knelt, picked up a single, unbroken tin cup from the debris, and wiped the soot from it with her sleeve. She stood up and turned to face him, holding the cup. "Where do we start?" she asked. Her voice was steady. It was the voice of a fighter. And so the work began. It was a brutal, punishing labor that stretched from before sunrise to long after sunset. The first days were spent clearing the wreckage, a grim task of archaeology and demolition. They dragged away charred beams, shoveled piles of ash, and salvaged what little they could. A handful of bent nails, a cast iron skillet, the warped head of a hammer. Every object was a ghost, a reminder of the life that had been lived there. Silas worked with a relentless, machine-like efficiency, his powerful body moving with an economy of motion that made every swing of the sledgehammer, every heave of the pry bar count. Alara, though not as strong, was just as determined. She learned to use the tools, her soft hands quickly becoming calloused and raw. She never complained, not about the blistering sun, not about the aching muscles, not about the constant, choking dust. They worked as a team, often without speaking, developing a rhythm and an understanding that transcended words. He would weaken a support with the sledge, and she would be there with the pry bar to pull it free. She would sort the salvageable wood, and he would begin stacking it for use in a temporary shelter. They ate their simple meals of dried meat and hardtack sitting on a fallen log, watching the sun set over the ruins of her past and the slow, emerging promise of her future. The land itself seemed to watch them, the silent creek providing them with cool, clear water, the wind whispering through the tall grass at the edge of the burn scar. It was a slow, arduous process of reclamation, not just of the land, but of her spirit. With every piece of debris they cleared, they were not just cleaning up a mess, they were defying the men who had made it. They were making a statement, written in sweat and toil, that they would not be erased. Weeks passed, the site was cleared, the blackened earth scraped away to reveal the clean dirt beneath. They had built a small, lean-to shelter against the stone chimney, a place to sleep and escape the worst of the sun. Now came the harder work, building anew. Silas took the wagon into the low hills a half-day's ride away, where a stand of pine offered up the timber they would need. He felled the trees himself, the sharp crack of his axe echoing in the quiet woods. He was not a carpenter by trade, but he was a man who understood wood, who knew how to read its grain and respect its strength. He worked with the same methodical patience he applied to everything, notching the logs, squaring them with an adze, preparing them for the cabin that would rise from the ashes. Alara stayed at the claim, tending to the animals and digging a new vegetable patch near the creek, her hands turning the soil, planting the few seeds she had managed to save. She was reclaiming her land one handful at a time. It was during this time that they received their first visitors. 2 riders appeared on the horizon, their shapes slowly resolving into men on horseback. They were Sterling's men. Silas saw them coming long before they arrived, his body tensing, his hand instinctively going to his hip, where a gun no longer hung. He stood straight, waiting, his axe held loosely in his hand. The men reined in their horses a short distance away, their faces etched with a mixture of surprise and contempt. They took in the cleared ground, the neat stacks of salvaged wood, the beginnings of a new foundation. One of them, a man with a sneering mouth and a cruel glint in his eye, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Well, look what we have here," he drawled, his voice lazy and mocking. "Looks like the widow found herself a stray dog to do her work." Alara came to stand beside Silas, her face pale, but her expression resolute. She did not hide behind him. Silas said nothing. He just watched them, his gaze as flat and hard as a piece of stone. His stillness was unnerving, more potent than any shouted threat. The second rider chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "Wasting your time, old man. Sterling wants this land. He'll get it. All you're building here is a bigger bonfire for us to light." They lingered for a few minutes more, throwing insults like stones, trying to get a reaction, to provoke a confrontation. They commented on Alara's appearance, on Silas's age, on the futility of their labor. They were betting, they said, on how many days it would take before they gave up and ran. Through it all, Silas remained silent and motionless. He did not rise to their bait. He simply stood there, a silent, immovable object, his presence a quiet refutation of their taunts. Eventually, bored by the lack of response, the men wheeled their horses around and rode off, their laughter trailing behind them on the wind. As they disappeared over the rise, Alara let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "They'll be back," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I know," Silas replied, his eyes still fixed on the horizon, where they had vanished. He turned and picked up his axe. "Let's get back to work." Their visits became a regular occurrence. Every few days a pair of riders would appear, always at a distance, just watching. They were a constant, menacing presence on the edge of their world, a reminder that the threat was not gone, merely patient. Sometimes they would ride closer, shouting taunts, but they never crossed onto the property line again. It was a war of nerves, a campaign of intimidation designed to wear them down, to make them feel watched and unsafe, to break their will through psychological pressure rather than direct violence. The townspeople, too, were a silent chorus to the drama. On her rare trips into town for supplies, Alara was met with averted gazes and whispered conversations that stopped the moment she entered the general store. They sold her what she needed, but their transactions were brisk and cool. They were afraid. Their fear was a wall she could not penetrate, and it left her feeling more isolated than ever. But the work continued. The foundation was laid, a solid rectangle of stone pulled from the creek bed. Then, slowly, painstakingly, the walls began to rise. They used the 2-man saw to cut the logs Silas had hauled, the rhythmic push and pull a conversation between them. It was grueling work, and their muscles screamed in protest at the end of each day, but with every log they hoisted into place, they were building more than a house. They were building a fortress, not of wood and stone, but of shared purpose and sheer, bloody-minded determination. The structure took shape, a raw, beautiful thing rising against the vast, empty landscape. It was a testament to their defiance, a symbol of their refusal to be broken. And as it grew, so did something else. A quiet, unspoken bond between the two of them, forged in the crucible of shared hardship and mutual respect. They were no longer just a man and a woman. They were partners in a silent, desperate battle for a small piece of the world. The day came when the roof beams were ready to be set, the final, most difficult stage of the framing. It was a task that required strength, precision, and a level of coordination that would test them to their limits. They had worked all morning, preparing the heavy beams, and were about to attempt to hoist the first one into place when a new figure appeared on the horizon. This was not a pair of riders. It was a single man in a smart, dark buggy, pulled by a fine-looking black horse. He drove with an air of unhurried confidence, as if the entire landscape belonged to him. As the buggy drew closer, Silas felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The man was well dressed in a dark suit and a clean hat, a stark contrast to the dusty, sweat-stained world he was entering. He pulled the buggy to a halt, a respectful distance from the half-built cabin, and stepped down. He was of middling height, with a neat beard and eyes that were intelligent and utterly devoid of warmth. This was Sterling. He walked toward them, his polished boots making no sound in the soft dirt. He moved with the easy assurance of a man accustomed to power, a man who had never had to raise his voice to be obeyed. He stopped a few feet away, taking in the scene with a look of detached amusement. The sturdy walls, the neatly stacked lumber, the two figures covered in sawdust and sweat. He removed his hat, a gesture of mock politeness. "An impressive effort," he said, his voice smooth and cultured. "Truly, I hadn't realized you had such tenacity, Mrs. Calloway." Alara stiffened, her hand tightening on the rope she was holding. "This is my land, Mr. Sterling." Sterling smiled, a thin, patronizing expression. "A piece of paper says it is. A piece of paper that is becoming more inconvenient by the day." He turned his attention to Silas, his gaze sweeping over him with a dismissive air, as if sizing up a piece of livestock. "And you, I've been asking about you, the quiet man who lives out on the edge of nowhere. Some say you're just a failed prospector, but others," he paused, letting the word hang in the air, "others tell a different story. They mention a name from a different life, a name that used to make people nervous." Silas did not react. His face was a granite mask. He just stood there, his presence a silent, unyielding fact. Sterling seemed disappointed by the lack of a response. He sighed, as if burdened by their foolishness. "Look," he said, his tone shifting to one of reasonable negotiation. "This has gone on long enough. I am a businessman, not a monster. I will pay you for your trouble. I'll buy the lumber you've cut, pay you a fair price for the claim, and you can both walk away with something in your pockets, more than you would have had otherwise." He was looking at Alara, but the offer was a dismissal of everything she had fought for, a reduction of her home, her husband's dream, their entire life, into a simple financial transaction. He was offering to buy her dignity. Alara looked from Sterling's placid, confident face to the half-built house behind her. She looked at the solid walls, the stacks of wood, the tools lying on the ground. She looked at the calluses on her own hands. Everything she had endured, everything they had built, was in that gaze. She straightened her back, and when she spoke, her voice was clear and strong, without a trace of fear. "This is my home." Sterling's smile vanished. His eyes went cold. It was the first time she had seen the mask slip, the first glimpse of the snake beneath the civilized skin. He had not expected this. He had expected a broken woman, grateful for any scrap he might throw her. He laughed, a short, sharp, ugly sound. "A home? It's a pile of wood in the middle of nowhere. It's nothing." He turned his full, venomous attention to Silas. "And you, I know who you are, Silas Kane. They called you the Stillwater Gun. But that name doesn't mean much when you're holding a hammer instead of a pistol, does it? You're just a tired old man playing at being a carpenter. You can't stop what's coming." The air grew thick and heavy. The wind died. This was the moment, the culmination of all the threats, all the intimidation, all the silent struggle. Sterling had laid his cards on the table. He had invoked Silas's past, trying to use it as a weapon to remind him of the violence he had supposedly left behind. He expected fear or anger, or a reckless grab for a gun that wasn't there. He expected the legend. He got the man. Silas did not move. He did not flinch. He did not even blink. He simply held Sterling's gaze, and in the profound, unnerving stillness of his eyes, Sterling saw something far more dangerous than the hot rage of a gunman. He saw a man who had made a deliberate choice, a man who had weighed the world and found it wanting, a man who had nothing left to lose and was therefore impossible to threaten. The silence stretched, taut and brittle. Finally, Silas spoke. His voice was low, quiet, and carried no more than the few feet between them, yet it landed with the force of a physical blow. "Get off her land." That was it. 3 simple words. A plain statement of fact. But in that moment, it was the most powerful sentence in the world. It was not a threat. It was a judgment. It was the drawing of a line in the dirt from which he would not retreat. Sterling stared at him, his face a mask of disbelief, then dawning fury. He was a man who was never told what to do. He opened his mouth to reply, to unleash the torrent of power and menace he held in reserve, but the words died in his throat. He saw in Silas's eyes not the ghost of a gunslinger, but the unshakable certainty of a man who would die on this spot before he took a single step back. And for the first time in a very long time, Sterling felt a flicker of something he had almost forgotten. Fear. He held Silas's gaze for a second longer, then broke contact, his face flushing with a mixture of anger and humiliation. He turned on his heel without another word, strode back to his buggy, and whipped the horse into a frantic gallop, kicking up a cloud of dust that hung in the air long after he was gone. He was gone. They stood in the silence, the dust from Sterling's departure slowly settling around them. The tension did not vanish immediately. It bled out of the air, leaving behind a strange sense of lightness, of a great weight lifted. Alara looked at Silas, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and gratitude. He had faced down the monster, not with a gun, but with the sheer force of his will. He had won the battle without firing a shot. Silas did not look at her. He bent down, picked up the rope they had been about to use, and handed one end to her. "Let's get this beam up before we lose the light," he said, his voice as calm and steady as if nothing had happened. They returned to their work, but the air was different. The rhythm was different. The shadow of intimidation that had loomed over them for weeks had been banished. The casual visits from Sterling's men stopped. The distant, watchful eyes were gone. It was as if Sterling, having had his authority so completely and quietly dismantled, could not bear to look upon the source of his humiliation. His power had been in the belief of its own invincibility, and Silas had shown it to be hollow. The work went faster after that, fueled by a new sense of security and purpose. They set the roof beams, laid the planking, and raised the final wall. They built a door that hung straight and true, and windows that let in the morning light. The cabin was small, and it was not perfect. The logs were not perfectly uniform, the corners not perfectly square, but it was strong, it was solid, it was theirs, built not just of wood and stone, but of every moment of sweat, defiance, and shared resolve. The day they finished, they stood outside and simply looked at it, a structure of profound and simple dignity, standing firm against the vast, open sky. Smoke, clean and white, rose from the chimney, a signal not of destruction, but of life, of a home, of a future. It was a quiet triumph, a victory that would never be recorded in any history book, but was etched deeply into the grain of the wood and the soul of the land itself. Weeks later, autumn had begun to touch the edges of the plains, the fierce summer sun giving way to a crisp, golden light. The nights were cooler, and the grass had faded to a pale shade of yellow. The new cabin stood as if it had always been there, smoke curling from its chimney, a small garden plot beside it now yielding a modest harvest of squash and beans. It was a small pocket of order and life in the midst of the wild emptiness. Silas had packed his few belongings into his saddlebags. His horse was saddled and waiting. The job was done, the fence was mended, the house was built, the threat was gone. It was time for him to return to his solitude, to the quiet, empty life he had chosen. He stood by his horse, checking the cinch for the third time, delaying the inevitable moment of departure. Alara came out of the cabin. She did not say, "Don't go," or "Thank you," or any of the words that would have been insufficient for what had passed between them. She simply stood on the porch of the home he had built for her, wiping her hands on an apron. "Supper's ready," she said. Her voice was calm, an invitation, not a plea. She turned and went back inside, leaving the door open. He stood there for a long time, his hand on the saddle. He looked at the cabin, at the open door, at the warm, yellow light spilling out into the twilight. He looked at the long, empty trail that led back to his own small, quiet world. He could mount his horse and ride away, back to the silence, back to the man he was before the smoke appeared on the horizon. It would be the easy thing to do. It was what he had always done. But as he stood there, he realized that the silence he was returning to was no longer peace. It was just emptiness. And the solitude he had so carefully cultivated now felt less like a choice and more like a cage. He let out a slow breath. He unsaddled his horse, turned it out into the small corral they had built, and walked toward the light. He stepped through the door and into the warmth. The cabin smelled of baking bread and roasting meat. Alara was at the hearth, and she looked up and smiled, a small, genuine smile that transformed her face. A table was set for two. He sat down. He was home. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can build isn't a wall to keep the world out, but a door to let someone in. The greatest foundations are not made of stone, but of a quiet choice to stand for something, or someone, when it would be easier to walk away. Thank you for spending this time with us. If this story meant something to you, we hope you'll let us know by leaving a comment and that you'll continue to join us for more stories like this one. Your support is what allows us to keep building them. Until next time,